Blood stained the Wyoming dust red as Clara Whitmore pressed her trembling hand against the splintered wagon wheel, her whispered prayer lost in the wind. "Don't leave me here." She was the only one left breathing. The outlaws had taken everything, the horses, the strongbox, the lives of 6 innocent travelers. Now they circled back, and she had nowhere to run. Then a rifle shot cracked the silence. A lone figure emerged from the heat shimmer, moving with deadly purpose. The cowboy's voice was low, certain. "I'll never leave you." But could she trust a stranger when everyone else had abandoned her to die? If you want to know whether Clara survives this brutal frontier and finds something worth living for, stay with me until the very end, and please, hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The stagecoach lurched violently over another rut, and Clara Whitmore grabbed the leather strap above her head, her knuckles white against the worn material. Dust filtered through every crack in the wooden frame, coating her dark traveling dress and the small trunk wedged between her feet. She'd been on this coach for 3 days now, and Wyoming territory stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of prairie grass and distant mountains that made her feel simultaneously free and terrifyingly small. Across from her, an older woman named Mrs. Henderson dozed fitfully, her head bobbing with each jolt. Beside Clara sat a young prospector who hadn't stopped talking about silver strikes since they'd left the last way station. 2 other men rode on top with the driver and the shotgun guard, a banker heading west and a cattle buyer returning home. Clara pressed her forehead against the window frame, watching the landscape roll past. 6 weeks ago, she'd been in Philadelphia, living in her aunt's narrow townhouse, preparing to marry Edmund Hartwell, a man 20 years her senior whom her family had selected for his respectability and his accounting firm. The wedding dress had been purchased, the church had been reserved, everything had been decided, everything except whether she wanted any of it. The night before the wedding, Clara had stood in her room, surrounded by packed trunks and pristine white lace, and felt as though she were drowning. She'd made her decision in that moment, a decision that had shocked her family, scandalized Philadelphia society, and cost her almost everything she'd known. But not her freedom. She'd kept that. She'd taken her small inheritance from her mother's side of the family, bought a train ticket west, and answered an advertisement for a school teacher in a Wyoming settlement called Redemption Creek. The name had seemed like a sign. Maybe she could find redemption there, or at least a life that was truly her own. The prospector was saying something about assay offices when the first shot rang out. The sound cracked across the prairie like a thunderclap, and Clara's heart seized in her chest. Mrs. Henderson jerked awake with a startled cry. The stagecoach suddenly lurched forward as the driver whipped the horses into a desperate gallop. "Bandits!" someone shouted from above, and then the world dissolved into chaos. More shots exploded around them. Clara heard the driver cursing, the horses screaming, the thunder of hooves pursuing them across the hard pan. She was thrown against the side of the coach as it careened wildly, Mrs. Henderson tumbling into her lap. The prospector had gone pale, his hand fumbling for something in his coat. "Get down!" he shouted at them, but there was nowhere to go, no protection in the fragile wooden box hurtling across the prairie. Clara pressed herself against the floorboards, her arms wrapped around Mrs. Henderson's shaking shoulders. Through the window, she caught glimpses of riders, 4, maybe 5, their faces covered with bandanas, their guns flashing in the harsh sunlight. The shotgun guard fired back, and for a moment Clara dared to hope they might outrun the attackers. But then she heard a sickening thud from above, and something heavy fell past the window. The shotgun guard, she realized with horror. The man had fallen from the coach. Another shot. The driver cried out. The reins went slack. The horses, panicked and uncontrolled, veered sharply to the right. The coach tilted, seemed to hang suspended for an eternal moment, then crashed onto its side with a sound like the end of the world. Clara was airborne, then slammed into something hard. Pain exploded through her shoulder. She heard screaming, hers, Mrs. Henderson's, she couldn't tell. The coach skidded across the ground in a shower of splinters and dust before finally shuddering to a stop. For several heartbeats, there was only ringing silence and the taste of blood in her mouth. Then the voices came. Rough voices, laughing voices, voices that made Clara's skin crawl. "Check 'em all! Get the strongbox!" "This one's still breathing." A gunshot, then another, close. So close. Claire's eyes flew open. She was wedged in the wreckage, half buried under luggage and broken wood. Blood ran down her face from a cut on her forehead. Her shoulder screamed with pain when she tried to move. Through a gap in the splintered boards, she could see boots walking past, scuffed leather, spurs dragging in the dust. She held her breath, every muscle frozen. If they found her alive, they would kill her. She knew that with absolute certainty. Mrs. Henderson lay nearby, motionless, her eyes staring at nothing. The prospector was crumpled in the opposite corner, his chest still. Above her, through the shattered roof of the overturned coach, Clara could see the Wyoming sky, impossibly blue, indifferent to the horror playing out beneath it. "Strongbox is empty!" one of the outlaws shouted, and the rage in his voice made Clara's blood turn to ice. "What do you mean, empty?" "I mean there ain't nothing in it but papers. We got bad information." Cursing, the sound of something being kicked. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making any sound, though her whole body was shaking so badly she thought surely they would hear her trembling. "Check the bodies again. They gotta have something." More footsteps. Rough hands searching the dead. Clara closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, and prayed to anyone or anything that might be listening, that they wouldn't look too closely at the wreckage. Her hand found something hard beside her, a piece of broken wood, splintered to a sharp point. She gripped it like a weapon, though she knew it would be useless against bullets. "Someone's coming!" The words were sharp, urgent. The footsteps stopped. "Where?" "East. Riding hard, just one man, but mount up. We ain't sticking around to see who it is." The thunder of hooves. The outlaws were leaving, fleeing from whoever was approaching. Clara remained frozen in the wreckage, afraid to move, afraid to hope. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours, she couldn't tell. The sun beat down mercilessly. Her mouth was dry as cotton. The pain in her shoulder had spread to her whole right side, a deep, grinding ache that made her nauseated. She could hear a horse now, moving slowly through the wreckage. A single horse. The rider had dismounted. Footsteps approached, different from the outlaw's heavy tread. These were measured, careful. Clara's grip tightened on her makeshift weapon. What if this was one of them, coming back? What if... A shadow fell across the opening in the wreckage. A man's voice, low and rough. "Anyone alive in there?" Clara's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Please." The word was so quiet she wasn't sure he'd heard, but the shadow moved, and hands began carefully pulling away the broken boards. Sunlight flooded in, blinding her. She squinted up at the figure silhouetted against the sky, a tall man in a worn hat, his face in shadow. "Easy now," he said, his voice steady and calm despite the carnage around them. "Let me help you out." He reached in, and Clara flinched away, still gripping her piece of wood. The man froze. "I'm not going to hurt you, miss, but you're injured, and you need to get out of there before this whole thing collapses further." Something in his voice, the steadiness of it, the lack of threat, made Clara release her weapon. She reached up with her good arm, and his hand closed around hers. Strong, calloused, steady. He pulled her carefully from the wreckage, supporting her weight as she emerged into the harsh daylight. For a moment they were very close, close enough that she could see his face clearly beneath the brim of his hat. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with sharp features weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were a startling gray blue, like storm clouds, and they studied her with an intensity that was both unnerving and oddly reassuring. "Can you stand?" he asked. Clara tried. Her legs buckled immediately, and he caught her, one arm around her waist. The movement sent fresh pain shooting through her injured shoulder, and she gasped. "Your shoulder," he said, noticing how she held it. "Dislocated or broken, can't tell which yet." His gaze moved to the cut on her forehead. "You're bleeding pretty good, too." Clara became aware of the blood dripping down her face. She raised her good hand to touch it, and her fingers came away red. The sight made the world tilt dangerously. "Hey," his voice sharpened. "Stay with me. Don't you faint now." "The others," Clara managed. "Are they—" "Don't look," he said firmly, turning her away from the bodies scattered around the overturned coach. "There's nothing you can do for them now." But Clara had already seen. Mrs. Henderson, the prospector, the driver sprawled beside his horses, the shotgun guard lying 20 yards away. All dead. All murdered for a strongbox that had contained nothing but papers. Why? The word came out broken. Why would they? Because that's what men like that do. The cowboy's voice was hard now, edged with something that might have been anger or grief or both. They don't need a reason beyond greed. He looked down at her, and his expression softened slightly. Come on, let's get you somewhere safe. Safe? Clara almost laughed, the sound verging on hysteria. Where is safe? There's nothing out here but… My place isn't far, 3 miles east. I've got supplies, water. I can tend that shoulder. Clara stared at him, trying to make her shocked mind work. 3 miles in the wilderness with a complete stranger. Every warning she'd ever received about trusting unknown men echoed in her head. But what choice did she have? Stay here among the dead? Try to walk to the nearest settlement, wherever that was, with an injured shoulder and no water? I don't even know your name, she said weakly. Ethan Cole? He tilted his head slightly. And you are? Clara Whitmore. Well, Miss Whitmore, I give you my word that I mean you no harm. But you need help, and you need it soon. That shoulder needs attention, and you're going into shock. So you've got a choice to make, and you need to make it fast. Clara looked around at the devastation, at the overturned coach, the dead horses, the bodies of people who had been alive and breathing just minutes ago. The sun was already past its zenith. Evening would come, and then night, and she was alone in the wilderness with no supplies and no shelter. She looked back at Ethan Cole. His expression was patient, waiting, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. He was right. She needed to decide. I don't have much choice, do I? She said quietly. No, ma'am. I don't suppose you do. He paused. For what it's worth, I understand if you don't trust me, but I've got a sister about your age, and if she were in your position, I'd hope someone would help her. It was the detail about the sister that decided her. It made him real, human, connected to other people in ways that the faceless outlaws hadn't been. All right, Clara said. I'll go with you. Ethan nodded and moved to his horse, a solid bay gelding that had been standing patiently nearby. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and brought it to Clara. Drink slowly, he instructed, just a little at first. The water was warm and tasted like heaven. Clara forced herself to take only small sips, though she wanted to drain the entire canteen. Can you ride? Ethan asked. Clara looked at the horse, then at her injured shoulder. I don't think so. That's what I figured. Ethan moved to his saddlebags and pulled out a folded piece of canvas and some rope. Quickly, efficiently, he fashioned a rough sling for her arm. His movements were practiced, confident. He'd done this before, Clara realized, tended injuries in the field. This'll help keep it stable, he said, gently settling her arm into the sling. Even with his care, the movement hurt enough to make her vision blur. Sorry, he muttered. Can't be helped. When the sling was secure, he stepped back to his horse and swung into the saddle with easy grace. Then he reached down to her. I'm going to pull you up behind me. Use your good arm. I'll do most of the lifting, but you'll need to help as much as you can. Clara positioned herself beside the horse and reached up. Ethan's hand closed around her wrist, and in one smooth motion, he lifted her up behind him. She gasped as the movement jarred her shoulder, but then she was seated and Ethan was reaching back to position her good arm around his waist. Hold on, he said. We'll go slow, but you need to hold on. Clara wrapped her arm around him, acutely aware of how close they were, how dependent she was on this stranger. She could feel the solid muscle of his back against her, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Ethan turned the horse east, away from the wreckage. As they moved off, Clara couldn't help but look back one last time at the overturned stagecoach, the scattered bodies, the circling carry-on birds already gathering. This was supposed to be her journey to a new life. Instead, it had nearly been her death. Don't look back, Ethan said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Nothing good comes from dwelling on what's behind. They rode in silence across the prairie. Clara tried to focus on anything but the pain in her shoulder, the rhythm of the horse's gait, the warmth of the sun on her back, the distant mountains painting the horizon. But her mind kept circling back to the same terrifying thought. She was completely at this man's mercy. She knew nothing about him except his name. He could be taking her anywhere. He could be planning anything. And yet, something in her gut told her he was trustworthy. Maybe it was the way he'd been so careful with her injured shoulder. Maybe it was the steadiness in his voice. Or maybe she was just desperate enough to believe in the kindness of strangers because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. "You said you were heading to your place," Clara said after a long silence. "You have a ranch? Small spread, nothing fancy, run some cattle, keep to myself mostly. Family." A pause. "Not anymore. My sister married a few years back, moved to Colorado. Parents passed when I was young. I'm sorry." "Life out here," Ethan said simply. "It's hard, and it doesn't give you much time for grieving." He glanced back at her. "What about you? What brings a Philadelphia lady to Wyoming territory?" Clara stiffened. "How did you know I was from Philadelphia?" "Your trunk had a tag with the city name on it. Saw it when I was pulling you out." "Oh." Clara relaxed slightly. "Of course. A simple observation, not something sinister. I'm supposed to be a school teacher. There's a position in Redemption Creek." "Redemption Creek?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's 40 miles west of here. You were way off course." "The driver said we were taking a shortcut." "Some shortcut." Ethan's voice held a bitter edge. "More like an ambush route. Those outlaws probably bribed someone to alter the route, make the coach more vulnerable." The thought made Clara's stomach turn. Someone had planned this. Someone had known the coach would be in that desolate stretch with no help nearby. Those people hadn't died by chance. They'd been set up. "Do you think the outlaws will come back?" she asked, the fear sudden and sharp. "No. They got spooked when they saw me coming. By now they're probably 20 miles away, dividing up whatever they stole from the bodies." Ethan's voice was hard. "But I'll report it when I can. There's a federal marshal who covers this territory. He'll want to know." They rode on. The sun was lower now, painting the prairie in shades of amber and gold. Clara's shoulder throbbed with each step the horse took, and exhaustion was beginning to drag at her. The shock was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made it hard to think, hard to focus on anything but staying upright. "Almost there," Ethan said, and Clara realized she'd been swaying in the saddle. She forced her eyes open wider and saw it. A small cabin nestled in a fold of land near a creek lined with cottonwood trees. It was rough-built but solid-looking, with a barn nearby and a corral holding a few horses. Smoke curled from the chimney, which seemed strange, until Clara realized Ethan must have left a fire banked before he'd ridden out. "You live here alone?" she asked as they approached. "Just me and the horses, and a few head of cattle when they're not ranging." Ethan rode to the cabin and dismounted, then reached up to help Clara down. Easy now. Clara slid from the horse, and the moment her feet touched the ground, her legs gave out completely. Ethan caught her before she fell, supporting her weight with his arm around her waist. "Inside," he said. "Let's get you inside." The cabin was small but surprisingly neat. One main room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, a few chairs, and a bed in one corner covered with worn quilts. Ethan guided Clara to one of the chairs and helped her sit. "Wait here," he said, then went back outside to tend to his horse. Clara sat alone in the stranger's cabin and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she'd been on a stagecoach reading a book, thinking about the school she would teach in and the new life waiting for her in Redemption Creek. Now most of her fellow travelers were dead, her possessions were lost or destroyed, and she was dependent on the charity of a man she'd met an hour ago. The absurdity of it struck her, followed immediately by a wave of grief so strong it nearly knocked her breath away. Mrs. Henderson, who had shared peppermints with her at the way station, the young prospector with his enthusiastic dreams, the driver who had joked about the dust, all gone, all dead. Clara pressed her good hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. She would not break down, not now. She needed to stay strong, stay alert, stay... The door opened and Ethan came back in carrying his saddlebags. He took one look at Clara's face and his expression softened. "It's all right to cry," he said quietly. "You've been through hell today." "I'm fine," Clara said, but her voice broke on the words. And then the tears came anyway, hot and fast and unstoppable. Ethan set down his saddlebags and crossed to a shelf, returning with a clean cloth. He handed it to her wordlessly and then moved to the fireplace to build up the fire while she wept. When the tears finally subsided, Clara felt hollow and exhausted. She wiped her face with the cloth and took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." Ethan was at the table now, unpacking supplies from his saddlebags. "You survived something terrible today. You're allowed to feel it." He set a bottle and some clean cloths on the table, then filled a basin with water from a bucket. "Now let's take a look at that shoulder and that cut." Clara tensed. "You said you'd help, but you're not a doctor." "No, but I've set bones before. Worked as a ranch hand for years before I got this place. You learn to patch yourself and others up out here because the nearest doctor might be days away." He pulled a chair closer to hers. "I'm going to have to touch you. Is that all right?" The fact that he asked, that he gave her the choice, made Clara relax slightly. "Yes." Ethan moved carefully, gently examining the cut on her forehead first. "Not as bad as it looks. Head wounds bleed a lot. I'll clean it and bandage it." He dampened a cloth and cleaned the wound with sure, gentle movements. It stung, but Clara bit her lip and stayed still. "Good," Ethan murmured. "Now the shoulder. I need you to take off your dress so I can see it properly." Clara's face flushed. I'll turn my back while you do it. Get down to your chemise. Then tell me when you're ready." He stood and turned to face the fireplace, giving her privacy. Clara awkwardly struggled out of her dress with one hand, the fabric stiff with dust and blood. When she was down to her chemise and petticoat, she said, "All right." Ethan turned back and knelt beside her chair, his expression clinical and focused. He examined her shoulder carefully, his fingers probing the joint. Clara hissed in pain. "Dislocated," he said. "Not broken. That's good news. I can put it back in place, but it's going to hurt like hell for about 10 seconds. Can't you give me something for the pain first?" "I've got whiskey. That's about it." He fetched the bottle from the table and handed it to her. "Take a few good swallows." Clara had never been much of a drinker, but she did as he said, gulping down the harsh liquid until it burned in her chest and made her cough. "More," Ethan said. She drank again. The room was starting to feel pleasantly fuzzy around the edges. "All right." Ethan positioned himself carefully. "When I say 3, I'm going to pull and rotate your arm. It'll hurt, but then it'll be better. Understand?" Clara nodded, gripping the edge of the chair with her good hand. 1. Ethan braced her shoulder. 2. He didn't wait for 3. He pulled and twisted in one smooth motion, and Clara heard a pop that she felt all the way through her body. The pain was blinding, white hot, and she screamed, but then it was over, and the grinding agony in her shoulder had transformed into a dull, manageable ache. "Done," Ethan said. "Worst part's over. Just breathe." Clara realized she was shaking all over, tears streaming down her face again. "You said you'd wait for 3. If I'd counted to 3, you would have tensed up and made it worse. This way was faster." He was already binding her shoulder with strips of clean cloth, fashioning a proper sling. "You did good." I screamed. "Out here, there's nobody to hear but me and the horses, and we don't judge." Despite everything, Clara almost smiled. She watched as Ethan finished securing the sling, his movements practiced and efficient. "You'll need to keep this still for a few weeks," he said. "No heavy lifting, no sudden movements. It'll heal, but you have to let it." "A few weeks?" Clara's mind tried to grasp that timeline. "But I need to get to Redemption Creek. The school will have to wait." Ethan stood and moved to a trunk in the corner, pulling out a clean shirt. "You can't travel 40 miles with that shoulder. Not safely. You'll need time to heal." "I can't stay here for weeks," Clara protested, though even as she said it, she knew he was right. She could barely move without pain. How could she possibly ride a horse or endure another stagecoach journey? "You don't have much choice," Ethan said, bringing her the shirt. "Here. This'll be more comfortable than your dress. I'll turn around again." When Clara had changed into the oversized shirt, which hung to her knees like a nightgown, Ethan helped her move to the bed in the corner. "You need rest," he said. "Your body's been through trauma. Sleep is the best medicine for that." Clara wanted to argue, to insist that she couldn't just stay here with a strange man for weeks, that there had to be another option. But exhaustion was crashing over her like a wave, the whiskey and the trauma and the pain all conspiring to drag her down into darkness. "What will you do?" she asked as her eyes began to close. "Where will you sleep?" "I'll make a bedroll by the fire. Don't worry about me." The last thing Clara saw before sleep claimed her was Ethan moving to the fireplace, settling onto the floor with a blanket, his rifle within easy reach. Despite everything, despite the horror of the day, despite being alone in a cabin with a stranger in the middle of the wilderness, she felt oddly safe. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and for a disoriented moment she thought she was back in her aunt's house in Philadelphia. Then pain lanced through her shoulder, and everything came rushing back. The ambush, the bodies, the silent cowboy who had pulled her from the wreckage. She opened her eyes to find pale morning light filtering through the cabin's single window. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and Ethan stood at the stove with his back to her, tending a skillet. He'd removed his hat, and she could see his dark hair was slightly too long, curling at his collar. "You're awake," he said without turning around. "How's the shoulder?" Clara tested it carefully. It ached, deep and insistent, but the sharp agony of yesterday was gone. "Better, still hurts. It will for a while, but the worst is past." He turned, carrying a tin plate with bacon and some kind of fried bread. "You need to eat. Keep your strength up." Clara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The room spun and her stomach lurched. "Easy," Ethan said, setting the plate down and moving to help her. He propped pillows behind her back, supporting her with surprising gentleness. "You're still weak from shock. Don't rush it." When Clara was settled, he handed her the plate. She realized suddenly that she was ravenous. She hadn't eaten since the previous morning at the way station. The bacon was crispy and salty, the fried bread dense and filling. It was simple food, but it tasted better than any fancy Philadelphia meal she could remember. "Thank you," she said between bites. Ethan just nodded and returned to the stove, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He brought one to her, and Clara wrapped her good hand around it gratefully, savoring the warmth. "What time is it?" she asked. "About 7. Sun's been up an hour." Ethan pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat, cradling his own coffee. "You slept straight through. That's good. You needed it." Clara looked around the cabin in the morning light, seeing details she'd missed the night before. The floor was rough wooden planks, swept clean. A few shelves held supplies, tins, sacks of flour and beans, a small collection of books. A rifle rack near the door held 2 rifles and a shotgun. The furniture was handmade but sturdy. Everything spoke of a life pared down to essentials, nothing wasted, nothing merely decorative. "You keep a neat house," she observed. "Learned early that disorder leads to problems out here. Can't find what you need when you need it. That's how you die." Ethan took a sip of coffee. "Besides, I don't like living in filth. How long have you been here?" 5 years. Bought the land with money I saved working ranches all over the territory. Built the cabin myself, 1 log at a time." There was quiet pride in his voice. "It's not much, but it's mine. Nobody can take it from me." Clara heard something in those words. A deep need for ownership, for permanence, for something that couldn't be taken away. She understood that need. Wasn't that why she'd fled Philadelphia? To build a life that was hers, not something handed to her by others. "Tell me about your family," she said. "You mentioned a sister." Ethan's expression softened slightly. "Sarah. She's 3 years younger than me, married a good man, a carpenter in Boulder. They've got a baby now, a boy. I haven't seen them in over a year." "You must miss them." "I do. But that's the price of this life. Distance." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "What about your family? They know where you are?" Clara's throat tightened. "They know I left. I'm not sure they care where I ended up." "They didn't want you to go." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "No. They wanted me to marry a man I didn't love and live a life I didn't want. When I refused, my aunt said I was throwing away my future and disgracing the family." She stared down at her coffee. "Maybe she was right. Maybe coming out here was foolish. Look what happened." "What happened wasn't your fault," Ethan said firmly. Those outlaws would have hit that stage whether you were on it or not. And you survived. That takes strength, not foolishness. I survived because you came along. Maybe. Or maybe you would have found another way. Ethan stood and collected her empty plate. Point is, you're here now. You're alive. That counts for something. Clara watched him move to the wash basin, his movements economical and practiced. There was something deeply reassuring about his steadiness, the way he seemed utterly unshaken by having a strange woman in his cabin. Most men she knew would have been flustered or would have taken advantage of the situation. Ethan simply treated her with matter-of-fact kindness, as if rescuing injured women was something he did every day. How long do you think before I can travel? She asked. 3 weeks? Maybe 4? Depends on how fast you heal. He glanced back at her. I know that's not what you want to hear, but pushing it will only make things worse. You damage that shoulder again before it's healed, you could lose the use of it permanently. 3 or 4 weeks. Clara tried to imagine being here that long, alone with this stranger in the wilderness. The thought should have frightened her, but oddly it didn't. What frightened her more was what would happen when she finally did reach Redemption Creek. Would they still have a place for her? Would they believe her story about the ambush? Would anyone care that she'd lost everything? I had a trunk, she said suddenly, on the coach. It had all my belongings, my teaching certificates, my letters of reference. I'll ride back out there tomorrow, see what I can salvage. Can't promise anything. Those outlaws likely took whatever looked valuable. But I'll look. The kindness in the offer made Clara's eyes sting. Why are you helping me? Ethan was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the prairie beyond. My mother died when I was 15, he finally said. She got kicked by a horse, internal injuries. My father and I were out on the range, 3 days away. By the time we got home, she'd been alone for 2 days, dying slow. Our nearest neighbor found her, but it was too late. He turned back to Clara. Ever since then, I can't stand the thought of someone suffering alone when I could have helped. So I help. Simple as that. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the fear she'd been carrying. This man wasn't a threat. He was just someone who'd learned, through loss, the value of showing up when it mattered. I'm sorry about your mother, she said quietly. Long time ago now. Ethan moved to the door. I need to check on the horses and cattle. You should rest more. Call out if you need anything. I'll hear you. After he left, Clara carefully swung her legs out of bed. Her whole body ached, stiff and bruised, but she needed to move, to prove to herself that she was still functional. She made her way slowly to the window and looked out at Ethan's small ranch. The barn was weather-worn but solid, and the corral held 3 horses, including the bay gelding from yesterday. Beyond the buildings, the prairie stretched endlessly, grass rippling in the wind like waves on an ocean. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still white with snow. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, so different from the manicured parks and crowded streets of Philadelphia. Clara spotted Ethan near the barn, moving among the horses with easy confidence. As she watched, one of the horses, a gray mare, nuzzled his shoulder, and he paused to stroke her neck, speaking too quietly for Clara to hear the words. There was genuine affection in the gesture, a tenderness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. She turned away from the window and took stock of the cabin more carefully. The books on the shelf surprised her. She'd expected maybe a Bible and an almanac, but there were novels too. She recognized some of the titles: Cooper, Dickens, even some Whitman. A man who lived alone in the wilderness but still read poetry. The contradiction intrigued her. Clara's legs were starting to shake from the effort of standing, so she made her way back to the bed. She was settling against the pillows when the cabin door opened and Ethan returned, carrying a pail of fresh milk. You should be resting, he said, though there was no reproach in his voice. I was looking at your books. I didn't expect to find Whitman out here. Why? You think cowboys can't appreciate poetry? There was a hint of amusement in his expression. I like words. Always have. When you're alone as much as I am, books are good company. Do you have a favorite? Ethan considered as he strained the milk through cheesecloth. Depends on the day. When I'm feeling philosophical, Whitman. When I want adventure, Cooper. When I need to remember there's more to the world than grass and cattle, Dickens. Which one do you read most often? Honestly, I keep coming back to Walden. Thoreau understood something about solitude and self-reliance that resonates with this life. Clara found herself smiling. My aunt would have fainted to hear a cowboy quoting Thoreau. Well, your aunt's not here. Ethan covered the milk pail and set it aside. And out here, nobody cares about your pedigree or your education or what society thinks you should be. You're judged by what you do, not who you're supposed to be. Is that why you came out here, to get away from those judgments? Ethan pulled out a chair and sat, leaning back with his long legs stretched out. Partly. Also because I'm not good at taking orders from men I don't respect. Had a boss once, back in Texas, who treated his men like dirt and his animals worse. I told him what I thought of that, and he fired me. Figured after that I'd be better off working for myself. So you came to Wyoming. Came to Wyoming, saved my money, bought this land. It's hard work and lonely sometimes, but it's mine. Nobody tells me what to do or how to do it. He looked at her directly. I imagine you understand something about that, about wanting to live on your own terms. Clara met his gaze and found understanding there. Real understanding, not the patronizing sympathy she'd gotten from her family. Yes, she said simply, I do. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind outside. Clara felt herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months, maybe years. There was no pressure here to be anything other than herself. No expectations to meet, no role to play. Can I ask you something? Ethan said eventually. Of course. This man you were supposed to marry, did you love him at all? The question was direct, almost blunt, but Clara appreciated the honesty. No, I barely knew him. My aunt arranged it. He was respectable, financially stable, and willing to marry a woman with a small inheritance and no real prospects. I was supposed to be grateful. But you weren't. I was suffocating. Every day felt like being buried alive. I'd wake up and think about decades of the same dinners, the same conversations, the same life slowly crushing me into someone I didn't recognize. Clara's voice grew stronger. So I left. I took what was mine, and I left. That took courage? Or stupidity? The jury's still out. Ethan shook his head. Courage. Plenty of people live their whole lives in situations that make them miserable because they're too afraid to change. You weren't. That's not stupidity. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words. In Philadelphia, everyone had called her reckless, foolish, ungrateful. But Ethan saw it differently. He saw courage. What about you? She asked. Have you ever wanted something you couldn't have? Ethan's expression grew distant. Once, there was a woman, back when I was working a ranch in Colorado. Sarah's best friend, actually. Her name was Margaret. He paused, as if deciding how much to say. She was everything I thought I wanted, smart, beautiful, kind. I worked up the nerve to court her, and for a while I thought maybe we had a future. What happened? She married a bank manager from Denver, a man who could give her a house in town, a comfortable life, security. Ethan's voice was neutral, but Clara heard the old hurt beneath it. Can't blame her. I was just a ranch hand with big dreams and empty pockets. She chose practical, and maybe that was the right choice for her. But it hurt. Yeah, it hurt. Ethan stood and moved to the window, looking out at his land. That was 7 years ago. I'm over it now. But it taught me something, that this life isn't for everyone. It takes a particular kind of person to thrive out here, in the isolation and the hardship. Margaret wasn't that person, and that's fine. Better to find out before making promises neither of us could keep. Clara thought about that, about the kind of life Ethan led, about the strength it took to choose solitude and hard work over comfort and company. She'd been so focused on escaping Philadelphia that she hadn't really considered what she was running toward. Teaching in Redemption Creek had seemed like a solution, but was it what she truly wanted? Or just another version of the life everyone expected her to lead? Respectable, small, safe? Do you ever get lonely? She asked. Ethan turned back to her, and there was something raw in his expression. Sometimes. Mostly in winter, when the snow piles high and the days are short. But then spring comes, and I remember why I chose this. The freedom's worth the loneliness. I'm not sure I believe that. I think we all need connection, need other people. Maybe, but there's different kinds of connection. I've got neighbors I see at the settlement, ranchers I trade with, my sister when I can visit. That's enough for me. He paused. What about you? What kind of life were you hoping to find in Redemption Creek? Clara considered the question honestly. I don't know. I hadn't thought past getting away. I liked the idea of teaching, of helping children learn, but I'm not sure I really knew what I was signing up for. Well, you've got a few weeks to think about it now. No rush, no pressure, just time. The days began to settle into a rhythm. Ethan would rise early, start the fire, and make coffee before heading out to tend the horses and check on his small herd of cattle. Clara would wake to the sounds of him moving around the cabin, and they'd share a simple breakfast, bacon or salt pork, fried bread, sometimes eggs from the chickens Ethan kept in a coop behind the barn. After breakfast, Ethan would leave her with fresh water and instructions to rest, then disappear for hours to work the ranch. Clara would doze, read from Ethan's small library, and slowly regain her strength. Her shoulder was healing, the pain gradually diminishing to a dull ache that she could mostly ignore. In the evenings, they'd eat together, simple meals of beans and bacon, or stew when Ethan had time to let something simmer all day. Then they'd sit by the fire, and slowly, cautiously, they began to really talk. Ethan told her about learning to rope and ride as a boy, about the first time he'd helped deliver a calf and felt the miracle of new life in his hands. He told her about working ranches from Texas to Montana, about sleeping under the stars and waking to frost on his bedroll. He spoke with quiet poetry about the way the light changed on the prairie, the violence of spring thunderstorms, the impossible silence of winter snow. Clara found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, how she'd felt like a ghost in her own life in Philadelphia, seen but not heard, present but not known. How she'd spent hours in her room reading books about the West and imagining a different kind of life. How terrified and exhilarated she'd felt stepping onto the train, leaving everything behind. Do you miss it at all? Ethan asked one evening. They were sitting at the table playing cards by lamplight. He'd taught her poker, and she was getting better at reading his tells. Some things. I miss music, real music, orchestras and concerts. I miss bookstores and libraries. I miss my friend Caroline, though we'd grown apart after she married. Clara laid down her cards. But I don't miss the life itself. I don't miss feeling like I was slowly disappearing. Ethan studied his own cards. What would you do if you could do anything? If there were no rules, no expectations? Clara thought about it. I'd want to build something, not just teach from someone else's curriculum, but create a real school. One that taught practical skills alongside reading and writing. One that gave children, especially girls, real choices about their futures. That's ambitious. Too ambitious, probably. Schools need funding, community support, all the things a single woman with a damaged reputation doesn't have. Maybe. Ethan laid down his cards, a winning hand. Or maybe you just haven't found the right community yet. On the fourth day, Ethan rode out before dawn and didn't return until late afternoon. Clara tried not to worry, but as the hours stretched on, she found herself watching the window anxiously. When she finally saw him riding toward the cabin, leading a pack horse, relief flooded through her. He came in carrying her trunk. Found it, he said, setting it down. Mostly intact. The outlaws broke the lock, went through everything, but they left what they didn't want. Clara opened the trunk with shaking hands. Her clothes were rumpled and dirty, but there. Her books were still wrapped in their protective cloth. And at the bottom, miracle of miracles. The leather folder containing her teaching certificates and letters of reference was still there, slightly water-stained but readable. They left these? She said incredulously. Paper's no good to outlaws unless it's money. Ethan pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. Your jewelry's gone. They took anything that looked valuable. But the important things are here. Clara pressed the leather folder to her chest, overcome with gratitude. Without these documents, she would have had no way to prove her qualifications, no way to claim the teaching position. They were her ticket to the future she'd been trying to build. Thank you, she said, her voice thick. Thank you so much. Ethan just nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Also brought back the mail pouch. Figured the postal service might want to know what happened to it. I'll take it to the settlement next time I go. You went back to where... Clara's throat closed. She'd been trying not to think about the bodies, the blood, the carrion birds. Someone had to. I couldn't just leave them there. Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. I marked the spot, said some words. It's the best I could do. When I report to the marshal, they'll send someone to bring the bodies in proper. Clara nodded, unable to speak. The weight of what had happened, of how close she'd come to joining those bodies in the dust, pressed down on her. But Ethan had gone back. He'd faced that horror alone so she wouldn't have to, and he'd done what he could for the dead. That night, as Clara lay in bed and Ethan settled into his bedroll by the fire as he had every night, she said, Ethan? Yeah? You're a good man. I want you to know that. A long silence, then quietly. Just doing what's right. Anyone decent would do the same. No, not everyone would. Trust me on that. Another silence, and then, get some sleep, Clara. Tomorrow, I'll teach you how to make sourdough bread. The days continued to pass, and Clara grew stronger. She could move around the cabin now without pain, could help with simple tasks like cooking and washing dishes. Ethan taught her how to work his sourdough starter, how to knead bread until it had the right consistency, how to tell when the fire was the right temperature for baking. He taught her other things too, how to read the sky for coming weather, how to tell time by the sun's position, how to identify the plants that grew near the creek and which ones were edible or medicinal. Clara absorbed it all, fascinated by this practical knowledge that was so different from the refined education she'd received in Philadelphia. In turn, she shared what she knew. She read to Ethan in the evenings, choosing passages from his books and bringing them to life with her expressive voice. She taught him a card game her mother had taught her as a child. She told him about the places she'd read about in books, cities and countries neither of them would probably ever see. They were building something between them, Clara realized. Not romance. They were both too wary, too scarred for that, but friendship. Real friendship built on honesty and mutual respect and the strange intimacy of sharing close quarters. Tell me about Redemption Creek, Clara said one afternoon. They were outside, Clara sitting on the cabin steps while Ethan mended a bridle. What kind of place is it? Small, maybe 60 people, depending on the season. There's a general store, a church, a saloon, few ranches nearby. It's rough, like most frontier settlements, but the people are generally decent. He worked a knot loose from the leather. The schoolhouse is new. They built it last year. Before that, the preacher's wife taught the children in the church. Why did they need a new teacher? She passed away last winter, pneumonia. Left the preacher with 4 children and no one to teach the others. Ethan glanced up at her. You'll be important to them, Clara. A real teacher with proper training. That's rare out here. Clara felt the weight of that expectation. She'd been so focused on escaping Philadelphia that she hadn't really considered what it would mean to be responsible for children's education in a place where resources were scarce and every decision mattered. What if I'm not good enough? She asked quietly. You're already good enough. You're here, aren't you? You survived. You adapted. That's what matters out here. Not whether you know the perfect way to do something, but whether you're willing to figure it out. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, but it's not as complicated as people make it either. You do the next right thing, then the next, then the next. Eventually you look back and realize you've built a life. Clara looked at him, at his weathered face and steady hands, at the little ranch he'd carved out of the wilderness through sheer determination. He'd done exactly what he described. He'd built a life, one decision at a time. How did you know this was where you wanted to be? She asked. Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. I rode past this spot one spring, saw the creek and the cottonwoods, and the way the land folded here to make a natural shelter from the wind. Something just felt right, like I'd been looking for this place my whole life without knowing it. He tied off the mended bridle. Sometimes you don't know where you belong until you're standing in it. That night, a storm rolled in. Clara had seen storms in Philadelphia, the kind that brought rain and thunder and sent everyone scurrying indoors. But this was different. This was a plain storm, vast and violent, with wind that made the cabin walls creak and rain that hit the roof like gravel. Lightning lit up the world in stark white flashes. Thunder shook the ground. Clara sat up in bed, suddenly afraid in a way she hadn't been since the ambush. The storm felt malevolent, as if the land itself was angry. "It's all right," Ethan said from his bedroll. "Cabin's weathered worse than this." But even as he spoke, there was a tremendous crack outside, the sound of wood splitting, and then a crash that shook the building. Clara cried out, and Ethan was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Stay here," he ordered, and then he was out the door into the storm. Clara waited in the darkness, heart pounding. Minutes passed. Finally, Ethan returned, soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his head. "Lightning took down one of the cottonwoods," he said, setting down his rifle. "Fell across the corral fence. I need to get the horses secured before they panic and hurt themselves." "I'll help," Clara said, already getting up. "You don't need to—" "I'm helping." Clara pulled on her boots. Her shoulder was healed enough now that she could use both arms. "Tell me what to do." Ethan looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, put on my spare coat. It'll keep you drier." They went out together into the storm. The rain was cold and fierce, driven almost horizontal by the wind. Claire could barely see in front of her, but she followed Ethan's shape through the darkness to the corral. The tree had indeed fallen across the fence, splintering the rails. The horses were wild-eyed and frightened, dancing away from the broken wood. "We need to get them into the barn," Ethan shouted over the wind. "Can you open the barn door and then help me drive them toward it?" Clara ran to the barn, fighting the wind for every step. The door was heavy, but she managed to haul it open. Then she positioned herself as Ethan directed, and together they moved the horses toward safety. It was chaotic and frightening, with lightning turning the world into a nightmare landscape of flashing shadows. But Clara found herself moving without thinking, responding to Ethan's calls and signals, working with him as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. When the last horse was finally in the barn, they stood in the doorway catching their breath. They were both soaked through, shivering, but the horses were safe. "Good work," Ethan said, and there was genuine respect in his voice. They ran back to the cabin together, and once inside, Ethan built up the fire while Clara stripped off her wet coat with shaking hands. The warmth felt incredible against her chilled skin. "You should change," Ethan said, not looking at her. "I'll turn around, put on something dry." When they were both in dry clothes, they sat near the fire, letting the heat seep into their bones. The storm still raged outside, but inside it felt safe, almost cozy. "That was terrifying," Clara said, holding her hands toward the flames. "That was just a summer storm. Wait until you see winter." But Ethan was smiling slightly. "You did good out there. Didn't freeze up, didn't panic. Not everyone can keep their head in a crisis." Clara thought about the ambush, about how she'd frozen completely, paralyzed by fear. But tonight had been different. Tonight she'd moved, acted, helped. Maybe she was stronger than she'd thought. "I'm learning," she said. "We all are. Every day out here teaches you something, if you're paying attention." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to the storm slowly move past. And Clara realized, with a strange mixture of surprise and certainty, that she felt more at home in this rough cabin with this quiet man than she'd ever felt in her aunt's house, with all its comforts and expectations. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like freedom. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, as if the violence of the night before had scrubbed the world clean. Clara woke to find Ethan already outside, surveying the damage. She dressed quickly and joined him, stepping carefully around puddles and scattered debris. The fallen cottonwood was massive, its trunk as thick as a man's waist. It had taken out 20 feet of corral fence and narrowly missed the barn itself. In daylight, Claire could see how close they'd come to real disaster. If that tree had hit the barn with the horses inside, the animals could have been killed or seriously injured. "We were lucky," Ethan said, following her gaze. "Another few feet to the left and we'd have lost the barn." "Can you repair the fence?" "I'll have to. Can't leave the corral open." He turned to look at the tree, calculating. "This'll take me a few days. I'll need to cut up the tree, clear the debris, rebuild the fence from scratch." "I'll help," Claire said immediately. Ethan started to shake his head, then stopped. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd learned that Clara didn't make offers lightly, and she didn't back down when she'd committed to something. "All right, but we take it slow. Your shoulder's healing, but I don't want you damaging it again." They worked together through the morning, Ethan wielding an axe to section the massive trunk, while Clara dragged smaller branches out of the way. It was hard, sweaty work, and Clara's muscles protested every movement. but there was something deeply satisfying about it. The physical exertion, the visible progress, the simple fact of working alongside someone toward a common goal. As they paused for water at midday, Ethan said, "You know, when I first saw you in that wreckage, I figured you for a proper city lady, the kind who'd faint at the sight of hard work." "I was a proper city lady," Clara said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "At least I was supposed to be, but I never quite fit the mold. My aunt used to despair me because I'd rather read than practice embroidery. Said no man would want a wife who couldn't properly manage a household. Seems to me managing a household takes more than embroidery. That's what I thought. But telling my aunt that just earned me lectures about knowing my place." Clara took another drink, then looked at Ethan directly. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why haven't you married? You've got land, a home. Most men out here are desperate for wives." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his hand still on the axe handle. "After Margaret, I told myself I'd wait until I found someone who actually wanted this life. Not someone who was settling or making do or trying to change me into something more respectable." He met her eyes. "I'd rather be alone than be with someone who wishes I was different." Clara understood that deeply. Wasn't that exactly what she'd been running from? Edmund and her aunt and everyone else who wanted to reshape her into someone more acceptable, more convenient, more compliant. "That makes sense," she said quietly. "Though it must get lonely." "It does. But lonely's better than living a lie." Ethan hefted the axe again. "What about you? You planning to find a husband once you get to Redemption Creek?" The question caught Clara off guard. She hadn't really thought about it, had been so focused on establishing herself as a teacher, on building her own life, that marriage hadn't entered her calculations. "I don't know. I suppose if the right person came along, but I'm not looking. I want to stand on my own first, prove I can." That's wise. Too many people rush into things because they're afraid of being alone. Then they wake up 10 years later and realize they've built a life with the wrong person. Ethan swung the axe, and wood split with a satisfying crack. Better to be patient. Wait for something real. They worked until late afternoon when Clara's shoulder finally began to protest in earnest. Ethan noticed her favoring it and immediately called a halt to the day's work. "That's enough. We've made good progress. The rest can wait until tomorrow." That evening, as they ate a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Ethan said, "I need to ride into the settlement day after tomorrow. Take that mail pouch in, get some supplies. You're well enough to travel now if you want to come along." Clara's heart jumped. The settlement meant people, meant stepping back into the world she'd been sheltered from these past weeks. It meant moving forward with her plans to reach Redemption Creek. It meant leaving this cabin and the strange peace she'd found here. "How far is the settlement?" she asked. "About 8 miles. Little place called Cottonwood Station. We could make it there and back in a day if we left early." Clara nodded slowly. "I'd like to come. I should start figuring out how to get to Redemption Creek from there." Something flickered across Ethan's face, an expression too quick to name. "Right. Of course, that's what you came out here for." They finished the meal in silence that felt different from their usual companionable quiet. There was a weight to it now, an awareness that this interlude was temporary. Clara had a life waiting for her elsewhere. Ethan had made it clear from the beginning that this was just shelter until she healed. Neither of them had promised anything beyond that. So why did the thought of leaving make Clara's chest ache? That night, she lay awake long after Ethan's breathing had deepened into sleep. The cabin that had seemed so strange and foreign 3 weeks ago now felt familiar, safe. She knew the way the floorboards creaked near the door, the pattern of shadows the firelight cast on the walls, the sound of the wind moving through the cottonwoods outside. And she knew the man sleeping across the room, knew his silences and his rare smiles, knew how he moved through the world with quiet competence, knew the loneliness he carried beneath his self-sufficiency. They'd shared stories and meals and work, and somewhere in all of that, Ethan Cole had become the first person in Clara's life who saw her clearly and never once asked her to be different. The realization was both wonderful and terrifying. They set out for Cottonwood Station 2 days later, riding Ethan's horses in the cool morning air. Clara's shoulder had healed enough that she could manage her own horse now, a gentle mare named Buttercup that Ethan assured her could be trusted not to spook. The mail pouch was secured in Ethan's saddlebag, along with a list of supplies he needed. The ride was beautiful. The prairie had transformed in the weeks since the storm, wildflowers blooming in patches of purple and yellow. Hawks wheeled overhead, and once they saw a small herd of pronghorn antelope bounding across the grass with impossible grace. Clara drank it all in, trying to memorize every detail. "You've gotten good at riding," Ethan observed as they paused to let the horses drink from a creek. "When you first got here, you could barely stay in the saddle." "I've had a good teacher." Clara patted Buttercup's neck. "And a patient horse. She's a good girl, raised her from a foal." Ethan looked at Clara thoughtfully. "You know, you've changed since you first got here. You're different." "Different how?" "Stronger, more sure of yourself. When I pulled you out of that wreckage, you looked like you might break with a strong wind. Now you look like you could weather a storm." Clara considered that. He was right. She felt different. The terror of the ambush had forced something open in her, and these weeks with Ethan had allowed her to discover reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She'd learned to work with her hands, to face discomfort without complaint, to find satisfaction in simple accomplishments. "I think I needed this," she said quietly. "Time to catch my breath, to figure out who I am without everyone telling me who I should be." "And have you? Figured it out?" Clara smiled. "I'm getting there." Cottonwood Station appeared as they crested a low rise, a cluster of rough buildings huddled around a single dirt street. It was smaller than Clara had expected, maybe a dozen structures including a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small hotel, and what looked like a saloon. A few people moved about their business, and children played in the street. As they rode in, Clara noticed people staring. A woman appeared in the doorway of the general store, shading her eyes to watch them pass. Two men outside the blacksmith shop stopped their conversation to look. Clara felt suddenly self-conscious in her borrowed clothes, one of Ethan's old shirts tucked into a skirt she'd hastily mended from her trunk. Ethan dismounted outside the general store and helped Clara down. "They're just curious," he said quietly, reading her discomfort. "Strangers are news out here." Inside the store was dim and crowded with goods, barrels of flour and sugar, bolts of fabric, tools hanging from the walls, canned goods stacked on shelves. A heavy-set man with a gray beard stood behind the counter, and his eyes widened when he saw them. "Ethan Cole. Wasn't expecting to see you for another month." The man's gaze shifted to Clara, undisguised curiosity in his expression. "And who might this be?" "This is Miss Clara Whitmore. She was on the stage that got hit by outlaws a few weeks back. I found her in the wreckage." The storekeeper's expression shifted to shock and something like pity. "The Redemption Creek stage? We heard about that. Terrible business. They said everyone was killed." "Almost everyone," Ethan said grimly. "Miss Whitmore survived. I've got the mail pouch. Thought the postal service would want it back. I'll see it gets to the right people." The storekeeper extended his hand to Clara. "Samuel Brennan. I'm sorry for what happened to you, miss. Truly sorry." Clara shook his hand, moved by the genuine sympathy in his voice. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan. You heading to Redemption Creek to take the teaching position?" "That was the plan, yes." Brennan scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Funny thing about that, the town council posted a new notice last week, said they'd filled the position already, figured you weren't coming after the stage incident." Clara felt the words like a physical blow. The position was filled. Her carefully laid plans, the future she'd been building toward, had just evaporated. "They filled it?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "But I have my certificates, my references. I was supposed to—" "I know, miss, and I'm real sorry. But they couldn't wait indefinitely. Needed someone to start teaching the children." Brennan looked genuinely apologetic. "There's another settlement about 30 miles south, a place called Junction. Last I heard, they were looking for a teacher. Might be worth checking there." 30 miles south. Another journey, another gamble on a position that might or might not still be available by the time she got there. Clara felt suddenly unmoored, the careful future she'd constructed crumbling around her. Ethan's hand touched her shoulder gently. "Let's get the supplies. We can talk about this outside." Clara nodded numbly and followed him as he ordered flour, coffee, sugar, and various other necessities. She moved through the motions mechanically, her mind spinning. What was she supposed to do now? She had some money left, but not enough to sustain her indefinitely. She needed work, needed purpose. The teaching position had been her anchor, her reason for being here. Without it, she was just adrift. They loaded the supplies onto the pack horse in silence. Clara could feel Ethan watching her, but she didn't trust herself to speak. If she opened her mouth, she might cry, and she refused to break down on the main street of Cottonwood Station with strangers watching. "Miss Whitmore?" Clara turned to find a thin woman in a faded calico dress approaching her. She looked to be in her 30s, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. "I'm Martha Hayes. I heard what happened to you, and I wanted to say I'm glad you survived. It must have been terrifying." "Thank you," Clara managed. "I also couldn't help overhearing about the teaching position. I know it's not the same thing, but we've got a little school here in Cottonwood Station. Nothing fancy, just me teaching my own children and a few others in my front room. But there are more children now, and I could use help. It wouldn't pay much, but there's a room above the general store that's sitting empty. You could stay there." Clara stared at her, processing this unexpected offer. Teaching in someone's front room in a tiny settlement wasn't what she'd planned. It wasn't the proper schoolhouse, the official position, the respectable future she'd imagined. But it was something. It was a purpose, a place to start. "That's very kind of you," Clara said slowly, "but I wouldn't want to impose." "You wouldn't be imposing. I'd be grateful for the help, truly. And it seems like maybe you could use a place to land for a while." Martha's smile was warm and genuine. "Just think about it. If you're interested, come find me. I'm in the blue house at the end of the street." As Martha walked away, Clara felt Ethan's eyes on her. She turned to him, expecting to see relief that she'd found an alternative to staying at his cabin. Instead, his expression was carefully neutral. "That's a good offer," he said. "Martha's well respected here. It would be a decent position." "It would," Clara agreed. But even as she said it, something in her resisted. The offer was kind, practical, sensible. So why did it feel wrong? They mounted their horses and rode out of the settlement. Neither of them spoke for a long while, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, when they were well clear of the town, Ethan pulled his horse to a stop. "Clara, I need to say something." She stopped beside him, her heart suddenly pounding. "All right." Ethan seemed to be choosing his words carefully, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "These past weeks, having you at the cabin, it's been good, better than good. I got used to having someone to talk to share meals with, to work alongside. The place feels different with you there, less empty." Clara waited, hardly breathing. "I know you came out here to teach, to build your own life. And Martha's offer is a good one. It would give you work and a place to stay, let you be independent." Ethan finally looked at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. "But there's another option, if you wanted it." "What option?" "There's a settlement about 5 miles from my place. It's not much, just a few ranching families, a church, a small store. But they don't have a school yet. They've been talking about building one. They just need someone to teach." He paused, as if gathering courage. "If you wanted to take that on, you could stay. At my place, I mean. Not forever necessarily, but until you got established. Until you figured out if that's what you really want." Clara's breath caught. He was offering her a home. Not as charity, not as an obligation, but as something else, something neither of them had quite named yet. "Ethan, I couldn't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering." His voice was steady now, certain. "Look, I know this is fast. We've only known each other a few weeks. But out here, time works differently. You learn what matters quickly when life is stripped down to essentials. And what I've learned is that I don't want you to leave. Not because I'm lonely or because I need help around the ranch, but because—" He stopped, then started again. "Because I've never met anyone like you. Because when you're around, everything feels less bleak. Because I keep thinking about Margaret and how she chose the safe path and wondering if maybe that was for the best. Because you're different. You chose the hard path, the uncertain one. You risked everything for freedom. That takes courage, I respect." Clara felt tears prickling her eyes. Everything he was saying resonated with something deep in her chest. a longing she'd been trying not to acknowledge. "What exactly are you asking?" she said quietly. "I'm asking if you'd consider staying, not as a guest, but as—" Ethan took a breath. "I'm asking if you'd let me court you proper. See if what we've built these past weeks could become something more. And while you're figuring that out, you could teach those children who need it. Build the school you talked about." It was everything Clara wanted and everything she'd told herself she couldn't have. She'd come west to be independent, to prove she didn't need anyone. But the past weeks had taught her that independence didn't mean isolation, that strength could be found in partnership, not just solitude. "What about your life here?" she asked. "You said you chose this because you wanted freedom from expectations, from other people's demands. Taking me on, starting a school nearby, that's going to change things. Bring people around more. Make your life less simple." "I know, and I've thought about that." Ethan leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes intent on hers. "But I'm realizing that the freedom I chose might have just been another kind of cage. One I built myself because I was afraid of being hurt again. You showed me something different these past weeks. That letting someone in doesn't have to mean losing yourself. That sharing a life doesn't have to mean giving up who you are." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, at the cowboy who had pulled her from wreckage and given her shelter, who had taught her about sourdough and storms and the particular kind of peace that came from hard work and honest conversation, who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if this is just gratitude? What if I'm confusing being rescued with something else?" "I've thought about that too. And maybe there is some gratitude mixed in. But Clara, I've rescued people before, helped neighbors through hard times, tended injuries, offered shelter. Never once did I want any of them to stay after." His voice softened. "It's different with you. It's been different from the start." Clara felt the truth of his words settle into her bones. It was different. This connection they'd built through shared meals and quiet conversations and working side by side, it wasn't about debt or obligation. It was about recognition, about finding someone who saw you clearly and chose you anyway. "I want to say yes," Clara said slowly, "but I need you to understand something. I can't be someone who just fits into your life, who makes everything easier and more comfortable. I need my own purpose, my own work. The teaching isn't just something to do, it's important to me. It's part of who I am. I know that, and I'm not asking you to give it up. I'm asking you to build it here, where we can build other things too." Ethan's expression was earnest. "I can't promise it'll be easy. I can't promise I'll always say the right thing, or that we won't have hard days. But I can promise that I'll never ask you to be less than you are. That I'll support whatever you want to build, whatever dreams you want to chase." Clara thought about the future she'd planned in Philadelphia. The teaching position in Redemption Creek, the tidy narrative of the independent woman making her own way. It had been a good plan, a sensible plan, but it had also been lonely, a life built in reaction to what she was running from, rather than toward what she actually wanted. And what she wanted, she was realizing, was this. Not the fantasy of independence that meant doing everything alone, but the reality of partnership with someone who made her stronger rather than smaller. The freedom to build a school that mattered, in a place where she was already beginning to feel at home. The possibility of a future she couldn't have imagined 3 weeks ago. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff and finding solid ground. "Yes, I'll stay. I'll let you court me. I'll teach those children and build something worth having. But Ethan," she met his eyes directly, "I'm still figuring out who I am. I'm still learning how to be brave. I might make mistakes. I might fail. Then we'll figure it out together. And if you fail, we'll try again." Ethan smiled, a real smile, open and unguarded in a way she'd never seen. "I'm not looking for perfect, Clara. I'm looking for real. And what we have, this friendship, this understanding, that's the most real thing I've found in a long time." Clara urged her horse closer to his, close enough that she could reach out and take his hand. His fingers closed around hers, strong, calloused, steady. The touch sent warmth flooding through her. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we ride home. Together. And tomorrow we start figuring out the rest." Home. He'd said home. Not his place or the cabin, but home. As if she belonged there, as if it was already as much hers as his. They rode back across the prairie with the afternoon sun warm on their faces and their hands still linked between their horses. The mountains rose in the distance, no longer threatening, but welcoming. The wind that had seemed harsh and unforgiving now felt like freedom. When they reached the cabin, Ethan helped Clara down from her horse with extra care, his hands lingering at her waist. They stood close together for a moment, neither quite ready to step apart. "I should tell you," Ethan said quietly, "that courting out here works a little differently than it might have in Philadelphia. There's no chaperones, no proper protocols. It's just two people spending time together, being honest about their intentions." "And what are your intentions?" Clara asked, her heart racing. "To prove to you every day that choosing to stay here was the right decision, to build something with you that's worth the risk you're taking." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture achingly gentle. "And eventually, if you'll have me, to marry you, make this official and permanent." Clara's breath caught. "That's very direct." "I figure we've wasted enough time being anything but direct. Life's too short and too uncertain out here for playing games." He searched her face. "Does that scare you?" "Terrifies me," Clara admitted, "but not enough to make me leave." Ethan smiled again, and Clara realized she was seeing a side of him that probably very few people got to see. The warmth beneath the stoic exterior, the hope beneath the weathered independence. He was letting his guard down for her, showing her the vulnerable places he usually kept hidden. "Come on," he said, taking her hand again. "Let's get these supplies put away. Then I'll teach you how to make a proper ranch dinner. Can't have you living out here without knowing how to cook a decent steak." As they worked together to unload the pack horse and carry supplies into the cabin, Clara felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness that had been missing in Philadelphia, missing even on the stagecoach journey west. This wasn't the life she'd planned. It was better, harder, more uncertain, but infinitely more real. That evening they sat outside on the cabin steps as the sun set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Ethan had his arm around Clara's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling safe in a way that had nothing to do with protection and everything to do with being fully seen and accepted. "Tell me about this school you want to build," Ethan said. And Clara did. She told him about her vision of a place where children learned practical skills alongside reading and writing, where girls were taught that they had choices beyond marriage, where education opened doors instead of closing them. She talked about the books she wanted to teach from, the lessons she wanted to share, the kind of community she wanted to help create. Ethan listened without interrupting, his questions thoughtful when she paused. He didn't try to reshape her dreams into something more manageable or realistic. He simply helped her think through the practicalities, where the school might be located, how to gather funding, which families might be interested. "There's the old Henderson place," he said eventually, "about 3 miles from here. Family moved on last year, left the cabin empty. It's got good bones, and it's close enough to the settlement that children could walk there. We could ask if they'd be willing to sell cheap, or maybe let us use it in exchange for maintaining it." "We?" Clara looked up at him. "If you'll let me help, I'm not much of a scholar, but I can build desks, fix a roof, make sure the place is safe for children." Ethan met her gaze. "This matters to you, so it matters to me." Clara felt tears threatening again, happy tears this time. "You really mean that?" "Every word." He pulled her closer. "We're partners now, Clara. What you dream, we'll build together." As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge overhead, more stars than Clara had ever seen in Philadelphia, brilliant and countless, she thought about the woman she'd been 3 weeks ago. Frightened, uncertain, hiding in the wreckage of a stagecoach and whispering desperate prayers to no one in particular. That woman had been saved, not just from death, but from a life that would have slowly suffocated her. And the man who'd pulled her from the wreckage had given her more than shelter. He'd given her space to become who she was meant to be. He'd shown her that courage wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about choosing the right people to build a life with. "Thank you," Clara said softly. "For what?" "For answering when I asked you not to leave me. For keeping that promise. For giving me time to figure out that I didn't want you to leave me either." Ethan turned to face her fully, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Clara Whitmore, I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice." And then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Clara kissed him back, tasting hope and home, and a future she was finally brave enough to choose. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Clara rested her forehead against his. "So this is what freedom feels like." "This is what it feels like," Ethan agreed. "And it's just the beginning." The next morning brought a new kind of beginning. Clara woke to find Ethan already dressed, standing by the window with 2 cups of coffee. He turned when he heard her stirring, and the smile he gave her was different from any she'd seen before. Open, unguarded, full of quiet joy. "Morning," he said, bringing her a cup. "Thought we could ride out to the Henderson place today. See if it might work for your school." Clara sat up, accepting the coffee gratefully. The casual intimacy of the moment struck her, how natural it felt to wake up in his presence, to plan their day together. "You don't have ranch work that needs doing?" "Ranch work can wait a day. This is important." Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. They might have kissed last night, might have promised themselves to each other, but he was still mindful of propriety. "Besides, the sooner we get the school established, the sooner you can start teaching. I know that matters to you." It did matter. Even as Clara's heart had opened to the possibility of a future with Ethan, the need to have her own purpose, her own contribution to make, remained essential. She wasn't just choosing a man, she was choosing a life, and that life needed to include work that mattered. After a quick breakfast, they saddled the horses and rode out together. The morning was cool and fresh, the prairie grass still wet with dew. Ethan led them northeast, following a path that wound between low hills covered with sage and wildflowers. As they rode, he pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a bend in the creek that marked property boundaries, the distant roof of a neighboring ranch. "How many families are in the area, Tiorka?" Clara asked. "Within 5 miles, maybe 8 or 10. Most are ranchers like me, but there's a farmer, a man who runs a small sawmill, and a couple who keep bees and make honey to sell." Ethan glanced back at her. "It's not a big community, but it's growing. More people coming west every year, looking for land and opportunity." "And their children? How many would need schooling?" "I'd guess 15, maybe 20 children between the ages of 5 and 14. Right now, most of them get taught at home if they get taught at all. Some of the mothers do what they can, but they're already stretched thin with all the other work. A real school, with a real teacher, that would be something special." The Henderson place appeared as they crested a hill, a log cabin larger than Ethan's, with a small barn and a well-maintained corral. The property had obviously been cared for once, though now weeds grew tall around the buildings and one of the shutters hung crooked. They dismounted and approached the cabin. The door was unlocked, and Ethan pushed it open carefully, checking for signs of animals or instability before letting Clara enter. Inside, the single large room was dusty but structurally sound. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and windows on 2 sides let in good light. The wooden floor was worn but intact, and the ceiling showed no signs of leaks. "It's perfect," Clara breathed, already imagining how it could be transformed. "We could put desks here, along this wall. Use the fireplace for heat in winter. That corner could be a library, and we'd have space for a blackboard here." Ethan watched her move through the space, her eyes bright with possibility. "The barn could be used for storage. Maybe keep a couple of horses here so children who live farther out could ride in. And we'd need books, slates, chalk, maps." Clara was mentally cataloging what they'd need. "I have some books in my trunk, but we'd need more. And proper desks." "I can build desks," Ethan said. "Got plenty of lumber from that cottonwood that came down. Might as well put it to good use." Clara turned to him, overwhelmed by his support. "You'd really do that? Build furniture for a school?" "Clara, I told you last night, what matters to you matters to me. Besides, this is good for the whole community. These children deserve an education." He moved to stand beside her, looking around the room with a practical eye. "We'll need to clean this place top to bottom, fix that shutter, maybe reinforce the corral fence. But it's doable. We could have it ready in a month, maybe less." "We?" Clara said again, still getting used to the word. "We," Ethan confirmed. "You're not doing this alone. Not anymore." Over the next few weeks, they threw themselves into the work. Ethan rode out to speak with the families in the area, gauging interest and explaining Clara's qualifications. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Parents were eager for their children to have proper schooling, and several offered to help with the preparations. Meanwhile, Clara and Ethan worked to transform the Henderson cabin. They scrubbed every surface, repaired the crooked shutter, and patched a few spots in the roof. Ethan built 6 sturdy desks from the cottonwood lumber, each one carefully sanded smooth so no child would get splinters. Clara made cushions for the seats from fabric she'd bought at the general store, stuffing them with prairie grass that she and Ethan had dried in the sun. As they worked side by side, Clara learned more about the man she'd agreed to build a life with. She learned that he sang quietly to himself when he was concentrating on detailed work, that he had a perfectionist streak when it came to craftsmanship, that he was endlessly patient when teaching her how to use tools properly. She learned that he took his coffee black and strong, that he couldn't abide waste of any kind, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed and happy. And Ethan learned about Clara. He discovered that she was fiercely determined once she set her mind to something, that she had opinions about everything from literature to politics, and wasn't afraid to share them, that she could make him laugh with her wry observations about frontier life. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, that she never complained even when the work was hard and her hands were blistered, that she had a gift for making any space feel warm and welcoming. One evening, as they sat on the steps of the Henderson cabin watching the sunset after a long day's work, Clara said, "I've been thinking about what to call this place. The school, I figured it would just be Henderson School after the property. But that doesn't mean anything to the children who'll learn here. I want something that speaks to what we're trying to build." Clara leaned against Ethan's shoulder. "What about Freedom School? For the freedom to learn, to grow, to choose your own path." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Freedom School. I like that. It suits you. Suits what you're trying to do here." "Suits us," Clara corrected gently. "This is ours, Ethan, not just mine." He turned to kiss her forehead, a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Ours," he agreed. The day before the school was set to open, Martha Hayes rode out from Cottonwood Station with her husband Tom. They'd heard about the school and wanted to offer their support. Martha brought books, a dozen primers and readers that her own children had outgrown, and Tom brought a large blackboard he'd had in his barn. "Figured you could use this more than we could," Tom said, helping Ethan carry the blackboard inside. "Martha's been singing your praises to everyone in the settlement, says you're exactly what this area needs." Clara felt her face flush with pleasure and embarrassment. "That's very kind, but I haven't even taught my first lesson yet." "Don't need to teach a lesson for folks to recognize quality when they see it," Martha said warmly. "The way you've fixed this place up, the care you're putting into everything, that tells us what we need to know about the kind of teacher you'll be." That evening, after the Hayes had left, Clara stood in the transformed cabin and felt a swell of pride. The desks were arranged in neat rows, each one sturdy and smooth. The blackboard hung on the wall, ready for chalk. The small library corner held the books Martha had brought along with Clara's own collection. Curtains she'd sewn hung at the windows, and a colorful rug, a wedding gift from one of the neighboring families who'd heard about the school, warmed the center of the floor. "It's really happening," she said softly. Ethan came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "You did this. You made something from nothing." "We did this," Clara corrected. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." "Maybe, but the vision was yours. I just helped build it." He pulled her closer. "You ready for tomorrow?" Clara took a deep breath. Tomorrow, children would arrive for the first day of school. Tomorrow, she would step into the role she'd crossed half a continent to claim. Tomorrow, everything would become real. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "What if I'm not good enough? What if the parents are disappointed? What if—" "Clara." Ethan turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "You are more than good enough. You're educated, passionate, dedicated. Those children are lucky to have you. And if there are rough spots, if things don't go perfectly at first, you'll figure it out. That's what you do. You adapt, you learn, you persevere. You have a lot of faith in me. I have the right amount of faith in you, the amount you deserve." He kissed her softly. "Now come on, let's go home. You need rest before the big day. Home. The word still sent warmth through Clara's chest. Ethan's cabin had become home over these past weeks, a place where she felt safe, valued, and wholly herself. The first day of Freedom School dawned clear and bright. Clara woke early, her stomach a tangle of nerves and excitement. She dressed carefully in the one good dress she'd salvaged from her trunk, pinning up her hair in a neat style that she hoped struck the right balance between professional and approachable. Ethan made her breakfast, though she could barely eat. "You're going to do great," he assured her as he packed a lunch for her to take. "Just be yourself. That's more than enough." They rode to the school together, arriving an hour early. Clara wanted time to prepare, to make sure everything was perfect. As she arranged books and wrote the day's lesson on the blackboard, she heard the sound of horses and wagons approaching. The children arrived with their parents, shy and curious. There were 18 of them, ranging from a tiny girl of 5 to a lanky boy of 13. Some came from families Clara had met during the preparation weeks. Others were strangers, but all were eager to learn. The parents lingered, introducing themselves and their children. A woman named Sarah Patterson pressed Clara's hand warmly. "We're so grateful you're here. My daughter Emily is 7, and she's been desperate to learn to read properly. I do what I can, but you have real training." A gruff rancher named Dutch Morris nodded at Clara with grudging approval. "My boy Charlie's 10 and wild as they come. You have any trouble with him? You let me know. He needs education, but he also needs discipline." As the parents finally departed and Clara faced her classroom full of children for the first time, she felt a surge of purpose so strong it made her dizzy. This was why she'd come west, not just to escape Philadelphia, but to do something meaningful, to shape young minds, to open doors, to give these children the gift of knowledge. "Good morning," she said, and her voice came out clear and confident. "My name is Miss Whitmore, and welcome to Freedom School." The first day was chaos, as first days always are. Clara quickly realized that her students had vastly different levels of preparation. Some, like Emily Patterson, already knew their letters and could read simple words. Others had never held a book before. Some sat quietly and attentively. Others, like Charlie Morris, squirmed and fidgeted and tested boundaries. But Clara adapted. She divided the students into groups based on ability, giving each group appropriate tasks while she worked with others. She made learning a game when attention wandered, challenged the advanced students with harder questions when they grew bored, and showed endless patience with those who struggled. At the end of the day, as the last child was collected by his father, Clara sagged against her desk, exhausted but exhilarated. She'd done it. She'd taught her first day of school in her own classroom, and while it hadn't been perfect, it had been real. Ethan rode up just as she was locking the door. "How did it go?" "It was wonderful and terrible and completely overwhelming." Clara laughed, giddy with fatigue. "I loved every minute of it." He dismounted and pulled her into his arms, not caring who might see. "I knew you would. You were made for this." As autumn deepened into winter, a routine established itself. Clara taught Monday through Friday, rising early to ride to the school with Ethan, who would drop her off before heading to his ranch work. She'd teach all day, often staying late to prepare lessons or meet with parents. Then Ethan would return to ride home with her, and they'd spend the evenings cooking dinner, talking about their days, reading by the fire. On weekends, they worked on the ranch together. Clara learned to mend fences, to recognize signs of illness in cattle, to predict weather by reading the sky. She grew stronger, her hands calloused from work, her body lean and capable. The fragile city woman who'd arrived in Wyoming was gone, replaced by someone tougher and more self-assured. And through it all, their relationship deepened. They were courting in the frontier fashion, no elaborate rituals, no chaperones, just two people spending their days together and learning to navigate partnership. They had their first argument about a month in, when Clara wanted to spend her own small savings on books for the school, and Ethan insisted on paying for them himself. "You've already done so much," Clara protested. "The desks, the repairs, the time you've spent helping. I need to contribute too." "You are contributing. You're teaching those children, working yourself to exhaustion. That's contribution enough." "It's not the same. I need to know I'm building this with my own resources, not just accepting your charity." They'd gone back and forth until Ethan finally understood what she was really saying, that she needed to maintain her independence, to know that she was still capable of standing on her own, even as she leaned into partnership. "All right," he'd said eventually, "you buy the books. But I'm buying the winter coats for the children who need them, and you're not going to argue with me about that." Clara had agreed, and they'd sealed the compromise with a kiss. It had been their first real test, and they'd passed it by listening to each other, by understanding that compromise didn't mean either person had to sacrifice their core needs. As winter set in and snow began to dust the prairie, talk in the community turned to marriage. Several neighboring women asked Clara pointed questions about when she and Ethan would be making things official. Even the children at school had started asking if Mr. Cole was going to be her husband. One evening, as they sat by the fire with snow falling softly outside, Ethan said, "People are talking." "I know. Martha cornered me at the general store last week and asked if we were planning a spring wedding." "What did you tell her?" "That it wasn't any of her business." Clara looked up from the sock she was darning. "But the truth is, I don't know. We've never really talked about timing." Ethan set down the harness he'd been oiling and turned to face her fully. "I meant what I said that day on the prairie. I want to marry you, Clara. I want to make this permanent and official. But I also don't want to rush you. We've only known each other 4 months." "4 months that have felt like a lifetime," Clara said softly. "I feel like I've known you forever, like I've been waiting my whole life for someone who sees me the way you do." "So what are we waiting for?" Clara considered. In Philadelphia, a courtship of less than a year would have been scandalous. But they weren't in Philadelphia. Out here, people married quickly out of practical necessity, but also because life was uncertain and waiting meant risking loss. "I think I wanted to prove something," she said slowly, "that I could make it on my own, that choosing you wasn't just about needing security or rescue. I wanted to know I was strong enough to stand alone before I chose to stand with someone else." "And do you know that now?" Clara looked around the cabin, at the life they'd built together, at the school she'd established, at the woman she'd become over these months of hard work and growth. "Yes, I know I could make it alone if I had to, but I don't want to. I want to build a life with you, not because I need to, but because I choose to." Ethan moved to kneel in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. "Clara Whitmore, I don't have a fancy ring or pretty words prepared, but I love you. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you face every challenge head on. I love coming home to you at the end of the day. I love the life we're building together. Will you marry me?" Clara's vision blurred with tears. Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, deep and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Clara laughed through her tears. "We should probably tell people before the rumor mill does it for us." "Tomorrow," Ethan agreed. "Tonight, let's just be us." They married on a Saturday in early December, just before the worst of the winter storms arrived. The ceremony was held in the small church near the settlement, with half the county in attendance. Martha Hayes cried through the entire service, and several ranchers Clara had never met showed up because news of the wedding had spread, and everyone wanted to witness the union of the school teacher and the solitary cowboy who'd finally found his match. Clara wore a simple dress she'd made herself, pale blue wool that brought out her eyes. She'd woven prairie flowers into her hair, now long enough to curl at her shoulders. She walked down the aisle alone, no one to give her away because she was giving herself freely. Ethan stood at the front in his best clothes, clean-shaven and handsome, and looking at Clara as if she were the only person in the world. When she reached him, he took her hands and they spoke their vows simply, promising to stand together through whatever came. There was no elaborate reception, just food brought by neighbors and shared in the church hall. Roasted meat, fresh bread, cakes and pies. People ate and laughed and shared stories, celebrating not just a marriage but the binding together of their small community. Dutch Morris approached Clara during the festivities, his gruff manner softened by what might have been whiskey or simple good feeling. "You've done good here, Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Cole, I suppose I should say now. My Charlie's reading now, actually enjoying books. Never thought I'd see the day. You're good for this place." Sarah Patterson hugged Clara tightly. "Emily asks to go to school even when she's feeling poorly. You've given these children something precious, not just education, but hope. Thank you. As the celebration wound down and the winter sun began to set, Ethan and Clara left the church together as husband and wife. They rode home through the snow, side by side, their breath-making clouds in the cold air. At the cabin, Ethan carried Clara over the threshold, and she laughed at the old tradition enacted in this rough frontier home. He set her down gently and kissed her, and this time there was no need to maintain respectful distance, no need to hold back. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cole," he murmured against her lips. "Welcome home, Mr. Cole," she replied and drew him closer. That night, in the warmth of the cabin with snow falling softly outside, they came together as husband and wife. There was tenderness and passion, nervousness and joy. Claire had been frightened of this aspect of marriage, had heard too many Philadelphia whispers about women's duty and men's demands. But with Ethan, it wasn't like that at all. He was patient and gentle, mindful of her inexperience, making sure she felt cherished rather than used. Afterward, lying wrapped in his arms under the quilts, Clara felt a completeness she'd never imagined. This was what love was supposed to be, not ownership or obligation, but choice and partnership and the profound intimacy of being known and accepted wholly. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked, his voice drowsy. "More than I knew it was possible to be," Clara answered honestly. "I keep thinking about the woman I was on that stagecoach, so determined to be independent and self-sufficient. She would have been horrified to know I'd end up married within 6 months of arriving in Wyoming. And what does the woman you are now think about that?" Clara smiled into the darkness. "She thinks that woman on the stagecoach didn't understand what freedom really meant. She thought it meant being alone, proving she didn't need anyone. But real freedom is having choices. And I chose you. I chose this. That makes all the difference." Ethan pulled her closer, and she felt his heart beating steady beneath her ear. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled, but inside they were warm and safe and together. Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here, the terror of the ambush, the desperate whisper she'd sent into the void, the cowboy who'd answered with a promise he'd kept. She'd asked him not to leave her, and he never had. And now, bound together by choice and love and the hard work of building a life, neither of them would ever be alone again. Winter settled over the prairie like a thick blanket, and with it came the challenges Clara had heard about but never truly experienced. The snow piled high against the cabin walls, and some mornings the temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the bucket by the door. On the worst days, when blizzards screamed across the plains, the school had to close and Clara and Ethan would huddle by the fire, reading or talking or simply sitting in companionable silence while the world raged outside. But there were beautiful moments too. Mornings when the sun broke through clouds to illuminate a landscape transformed into crystalline white, so bright it hurt to look at. Evenings when they'd stand on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the northern lights dance across the sky in ribbons of green and purple. Nights when the silence was so complete and profound that Clara could hear her own heartbeat and Ethan's breath beside her, and feel the enormous peace of being exactly where she belonged. Clara had been married 3 months when she first suspected she might be carrying a child. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed. But as the signs became unmistakable, the morning sickness that sent her running outside despite the cold, the exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure, the way her body was already beginning to change, she knew she had to tell Ethan. She chose an evening in late February, when the worst of winter seemed to be loosening its grip and the days were growing imperceptibly longer. They'd finished dinner and were sitting by the fire, Ethan reading from Whitman while Clara mended one of his shirts. She set down her sewing and took a breath. "Ethan, I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, hearing something in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." Clara reached for his hand. "I'm going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby." Ethan went very still, his eyes wide with shock that quickly transformed into joy so intense it made Clara's throat tighten. "A baby? You're certain?" "As certain as I can be. All the signs are there. I think it'll be sometime in late summer, August or September." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "Clara, a child. Our child." His voice was thick with emotion. "I can't believe it. I never thought... I hoped someday, but are you happy? Claire asked, though she could already see the answer written all over his face. Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. He pulled back to look at her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. But are you all right? Is there anything you need? Should you stop teaching? We should get the doctor out here to check on you. Ethan, breathe. Claire laughed, touched by his instant protectiveness. I'm healthy and strong. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I can keep teaching for a while yet, at least until it becomes too difficult. And yes, we'll get the doctor when the time comes, but for now, I just need you to be happy with me. I am. I'm so happy I can barely think straight. Ethan kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. You're going to be an amazing mother. And you'll be an amazing father, Clara said, though privately she felt a flutter of fear. What did she know about raising a child? She'd never even held a baby before, but she'd figure it out the way she'd figured out everything else since coming west. She'd learn, adapt, persevere. As spring arrived and the prairie burst into bloom, Clara's pregnancy became obvious. She had to let out her dresses and eventually gave up on her regular clothes entirely, wearing Ethan's shirts over loosely tied skirts. The children at school noticed and asked endless questions about the baby, which Clara answered with patient honesty. Several of the mothers brought her advice, remedies for morning sickness, predictions about whether she was carrying a boy or a girl based on how she was carrying. Martha Hayes rode out in April with a bag full of baby clothes her own children had outgrown. You'll need these, she said firmly, pressing them into Clara's hands. And when your time comes, you send for me. I've helped birth more babies than I can count. You shouldn't go through this alone. Clara accepted the clothes and the offer gratefully. The frontier might be harsh and isolating in many ways, but the community that had formed around the school had proven itself generous and supportive. These people looked after their own. As her pregnancy progressed, Clara had to make the difficult decision to close the school for the summer. She couldn't teach through the final months, and it made sense to take a break when the children were needed for farm and ranch work anyway. On the last day of the spring term, her students surprised her with gifts, drawings they'd made, wildflowers they'd picked, a carved wooden rattle that Charlie Morris's father had made. We'll miss you, Mrs. Cole, Emily Patterson said, hugging Clara's legs since her belly was now too large for a proper embrace. But we're so excited about the baby. I'll miss you too, Clara said, her voice catching. But I'll be back in the fall, and we'll pick up right where we left off. You all keep reading over the summer. You hear me? Walking out of Freedom School that day, knowing she wouldn't be back for months, Clara felt a pang of loss. Teaching had become such a core part of her identity, and stepping away from it, even temporarily, felt like losing a piece of herself. But she was also excited about the new chapter beginning. She was going to be a mother. She and Ethan were going to have a family. The summer was long and hot, and Clara grew increasingly uncomfortable as her belly swelled. Simple tasks became difficult, and she had to rely on Ethan more than she liked. He was unfailingly patient, taking over the cooking and cleaning without complaint, helping her bathe when she could no longer reach her own feet, rubbing her aching back at night. I feel useless, Clara said one evening in July, frustrated by her own limitations. I should be helping more. You're growing a human being inside your body. That's not useless. That's the most important work there is. Ethan kissed her swollen belly gently. You're doing exactly what you need to be doing. Clara wanted to argue, but she was too tired. Pregnancy had taught her uncomfortable lessons about accepting help, about acknowledging limitations, about the fact that strength sometimes meant admitting you couldn't do everything alone. On a sweltering August afternoon, Clara's water broke while she was standing in the kitchen trying to decide what to make for dinner. She felt the warm gush and looked down in shock at the puddle forming at her feet. Ethan! Her voice came out higher than she intended, edged with panic. He appeared from outside instantly, took one look at the situation, and went into action with the calm efficiency he showed in any crisis. All right, this is happening. Let me get you to bed, then I'll ride for Martha. There's time, Clara said, though she wasn't entirely sure. First babies take hours, don't they? We're not taking chances. Ethan helped her to the bed, then grabbed his hat. I'll be back as fast as I can. You just breathe, all right? Nice and slow. He was gone before Clara could respond, leaving her alone with the knowledge that her life was about to change in the most fundamental way possible. The first real contraction hit as she heard the thunder of Ethan's horse galloping away, and Clara gasped at the intensity of it. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, deep, primal, overwhelming. She lost track of time after that. The contractions came faster and harder, and Clara found herself making sounds she didn't recognize, her body taking over in ways her mind couldn't control. She was dimly aware of the cabin door opening, of Martha's capable hands on her forehead, of Ethan's voice murmuring reassurances. "You're doing so well," Martha said, checking Clara's progress with practiced efficiency. "It won't be much longer now." But it felt like forever. Clara had thought she understood hard work, had thought the challenges of frontier life had prepared her for anything. But nothing, not the ambush, not the injury, not the harsh Wyoming winter, had prepared her for the sheer physical ordeal of childbirth. She gripped Ethan's hand so tightly she thought she might break his fingers, but he never complained, never left her side. "I can't do this," she gasped between contractions. "Ethan, I can't." "Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I know. You can do this." His voice was steady, anchoring her when she felt like she might drift away on a tide of pain. "Next contraction, you're going to push," Martha said firmly. "Give it everything you have." Clara bore down with a strength she didn't know she possessed, driven by instinct and desperation and the primal need to bring this new life into the world. She pushed again and again until she thought she might tear apart, until Martha's voice rose with excitement. "The head's out! One more push, Clara, just one more!" Clara gathered every last reserve of strength and pushed with everything she had. She felt the baby slide free in a rush of relief so intense it brought tears to her eyes. And then cutting through the exhausted haze, she heard it, the thin protesting wail of a newborn. "It's a girl," Martha announced, wrapping the baby in a clean cloth. A beautiful, healthy girl. Ethan was crying, Clara realized, silent tears streaming down his weathered face as Martha placed the baby in Clara's arms. She looked down at the tiny, red, squalling creature she'd just brought into the world and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered, touching the baby's impossibly small hand. Tiny fingers wrapped around her own, gripping with surprising strength. "I'm your mama." "And I'm your papa," Ethan said, his voice breaking. He touched the baby's head with infinite gentleness. "She's perfect. Clara, she's perfect." They named her Rose after Clara's mother who had died when Clara was young. Rose Cole, born on a hot August afternoon in a log cabin on the Wyoming prairie, 7 months after her mother had whispered a desperate prayer in the wreckage of a stagecoach and her father had answered with a promise he'd kept. The first weeks with a newborn were harder than Clara had anticipated. Rose was a good baby overall, but she woke every few hours to nurse, leaving Clara exhausted and overwhelmed. Her body ached from the birth, and there were moments when she felt so depleted she wondered if she'd ever feel like herself again. But Ethan stepped up in ways that humbled her. He changed diapers without complaint, walked Rose for hours when she was fussy, took over all the household tasks so Clara could focus on healing and nursing. In the pre-dawn hours when Clara would sit up nursing Rose, Ethan would often wake and sit with them, just being present in the quiet darkness. "You don't have to stay up," Clara whispered one night. "You need your rest for the ranch work." "Ranch can wait. My family can't." Ethan reached over to stroke Rose's downy head. "I want to be here for these moments. They won't last forever." As summer faded into autumn, Clara began to feel more like herself. Her body healed, and she and Rose found their rhythm. The baby grew and changed daily, her unfocused newborn gaze sharpening into recognition, her random movements becoming more purposeful. When Rose first smiled, a real smile, not just gas, Clara and Ethan both nearly wept with joy. In late September, when Rose was 6 weeks old, Clara made the decision to reopen Freedom School. Martha offered to watch Rose during school hours, and though it hurt Clara's heart to leave her baby, she knew she needed this. Teaching was part of who she was, and Rose needed to see that her mother was more than just a mother, that women could be complex, multifaceted, ambitious. The children welcomed Clara back with enthusiasm, and several brought small gifts for baby Rose. Emily Patterson had drawn a picture of Clara holding a baby, and Clara tucked it carefully into her book to save. "Did having a baby hurt?" one of the younger girls asked with wide eyes. Clara considered how to answer honestly without frightening them. Yes, it hurt quite a bit, but the moment I held Rose, the pain didn't matter anymore. Sometimes the most worthwhile things in life require us to be brave and endure difficulty. As autumn deepened and the first anniversary of Clara's arrival in Wyoming approached, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed. A year ago, she'd been Clara Whitmore, a frightened refugee from Philadelphia society, injured and traumatized and uncertain of her future. Now she was Clara Cole, wife, mother, teacher, member of a community that valued her contributions. One October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset with Rose sleeping in Clara's arms, Ethan said, "Do you ever regret it, choosing this life instead of the one you could have had?" Clara looked at him in surprise. "Never. Why would you ask that?" "Because it's hard. The winters are brutal. We're isolated. You work constantly. You could have had an easier life back east." "Easier, maybe, but not better. Not real." Clara shifted Rose gently. "Back there, I was slowly disappearing. Here, I found myself. Found you. Found our daughter and our community and work that matters. This life isn't easy, but it's mine. Ours. That makes all the difference." Ethan pulled her close, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "I love you, Clara Cole. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And I love you." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you for not leaving me that day. Thank you for keeping your promise." "Always," Ethan said softly. "I'll always keep my promises to you." The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. A second daughter, Margaret, arrived the following summer, named for Ethan's long-lost love as a gesture of peace with the past. 2 years after that came a son, Thomas, who had Ethan's gray-blue eyes and Clara's stubborn determination. Freedom School grew too, expanding to accommodate more students as new families settled in the area. Eventually, Clara had to hire an assistant teacher, a young woman from Colorado who reminded Clara of herself years earlier, seeking purpose and independence on the frontier. The ranch prospered under Ethan's careful management. He expanded the herd, built additional corrals, and became known throughout the territory for breeding quality horses. The income allowed them to add a room onto the cabin, then another, until it barely resembled the simple structure where Clara had recovered from her injuries all those years ago. There were hard times, too. A severe winter when they lost half their cattle to cold and starvation. A year when Rose was seriously ill with fever and Clara sat up with her for 3 nights straight, terrified she might lose her firstborn. Moments of disagreement and frustration when the stress of children and work and frontier life strained even their strong partnership. But they weathered it all together, the way they'd weathered that first storm when Clara had helped Ethan save the horses. They learned that a strong marriage wasn't one without conflict, but one where both partners chose to show up even when things were difficult, to listen even when they disagreed, to forgive even when they were hurt. On a spring morning 10 years after Clara's arrival in Wyoming, she stood on the porch of their expanded home and watched her children play in the yard. Rose was 11 now, already showing signs of her mother's love for learning and her father's quiet strength. Margaret was 8, creative and spirited, always making up stories and songs. Thomas was 6, fascinated by horses and determined to be a rancher like his father. Ethan came up behind Clara and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About how far we've come. About that terrified woman hiding in the wreckage of a stagecoach, whispering for help." "She was brave, that woman, braver than she knew." She found bravery because someone answered when she called, because a cowboy rode out of the dust and kept his promise. Clara turned in his arms to face him. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" "I said I'd never leave you." "And you haven't, not once, not ever." Clara kissed him softly. "We built something worth having, didn't we?" "We built something extraordinary," Ethan agreed. "A family, a school, a life that matters. All because you had the courage to ask for help, and I had the sense to offer it." Later that day, Clara rode out to Freedom School for the afternoon session. The school had a permanent building now, built by the community with funds raised through donations and fundraising dinners. It had 2 classrooms, a small library, and even a bell that Clara rang to start each day. As her students filed in, nearly 40 of them now, ranging from 5 to 16, Clara felt the familiar surge of purpose and satisfaction. Some of these children were siblings of her original students. Some were brand new to the area. All of them deserved the education she could provide, the doors she could open for them. "Good afternoon, class," she said, and their voices chorused back in unison. Clara moved to the blackboard and began writing the day's lesson, a passage from Whitman about the open road and the journey of self-discovery. As she wrote, she thought about her own journey, about the twisting path that had led from Philadelphia to this moment, about how sometimes you had to lose everything to find what truly mattered. After school, as the last students departed, Emily Patterson, now a young woman of 18, lingered behind. She'd become Clara's assistant teacher and would be taking over one of the classrooms full-time in the fall. "Mrs. Cole, I wanted to thank you," Emily said, "for everything you've taught me, for showing me that women can have choices. I've been accepted to the Teachers College in Laramie. I'm going to get my certification." Clara felt pride bloom warm in her chest. "Emily, that's wonderful news. You're going to be an excellent teacher." "Because I had an excellent teacher." Emily hugged Clara tightly. "You changed my life. You changed all our lives." As Clara rode home that evening, she thought about Emily's words. She'd come west to escape a life that was suffocating her, to claim independence and freedom. She'd found those things, but she'd found so much more. She'd found partnership and community. She'd found work that mattered and love that sustained her. She'd found that the strongest version of herself wasn't the one who stood alone, but the one who knew when to reach out, when to accept help, when to build bridges instead of walls. That night, after the children were tucked in bed and the house was quiet, Clara and Ethan sat outside under the stars. It had become their ritual over the years, this quiet time together at the end of the day, watching the vast Wyoming sky and talking about everything or nothing. "The Henderson family from Junction is moving away," Ethan mentioned. "Selling their ranch. I was thinking maybe we could buy it, expand our operation." "That would mean more work, more responsibility," Clara said thoughtfully. "It would. But Thomas is already showing interest in ranching, and Rose has been asking if she can learn the business side of things. We could build something even bigger, leave them a real legacy." Clara considered this vision of the future. Their children grown and capable, taking over and expanding what she and Ethan had built. "I like that idea. Let's do it." "Just like that? No debate about whether we can afford it or manage it?" Clara laughed. "We've managed everything else life has thrown at us. Why would this be different?" She squeezed his hand. "Besides, I trust us. We make a good team." "The best team," Ethan agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "What?" "That day I was riding back from checking the fence line and saw the dust cloud from the ambush. I almost didn't investigate, figured it was just a herd moving through. But something made me go closer, made me check." "Fate," Clara suggested. "Maybe, or maybe just luck. But whatever it was, I'm grateful for it every single day. Grateful that I was in the right place at the right time. Grateful that you trusted me enough to let me help you." Clara leaned against his shoulder, looking up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the black velvet sky. "I'm grateful too. For all of it, the good and the hard, the joy and the struggle. This life we've built together, it's everything I didn't know I wanted until I found it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. The prairie stretched out around them, vast and timeless, the land that had tested them and shaped them and given them everything that mattered. In the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The wind rustled through the grass with a sound like whispered secrets. Inside the house, their children slept safe and warm, dreaming of their own futures on this frontier that was slowly becoming less wild, more settled, but never less magnificent. Clara thought about the woman she'd been 10 years ago, scared and injured, whispering a desperate plea into the Wyoming dust. That woman had asked not to be left alone, and a stranger had promised he never would leave her. He'd kept that promise. But what they'd built together was so much more than rescue or obligation. It was partnership and respect, challenge and growth, love that deepened with every passing season. The plains that had nearly claimed her life had instead given her everything worth living for. The cowboy who'd pulled her from the wreckage had become her partner, her love, the father of her children. The desperate escape from Philadelphia had transformed into a homecoming more profound than she'd ever imagined possible. "Ethan," Clara said softly. "Hmm?" "Thank you for answering when I called. Thank you for that promise you made, and for keeping it every single day since." He turned to kiss her forehead, a gesture that had become as familiar as breathing over their years together. "Thank you for giving me someone worth keeping promises for turning this lonely ranch into a home, for showing me that love doesn't have to mean losing yourself. It can mean finding yourself in someone else's eyes." They stayed outside until the moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across the prairie. And when they finally went inside, it was to a home filled with love and laughter, built from hard work and harder choices, sustained by two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and decided to build something extraordinary together. The story that had begun with desperation and fear, with a whispered plea and a cowboy's promise, had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted, a testament to resilience and courage, to the power of choosing to stay even when leaving would be easier, to building a life rather than just surviving one. Clara Whitmore had come west seeking freedom and independence. Clara Cole had found something far more valuable, a life of purpose and partnership, a love that challenged and sustained her, a legacy she and Ethan were building together with every choice, every day, every moment of showing up for each other and for the life they'd chosen. And as she drifted off to sleep that night in Ethan's arms, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice, not just in staying, but in everything that had come after. In opening her heart, in building their family, in creating a life that was messy and hard and absolutely beautiful. She'd asked him not to leave her, and he never had. But more importantly, she'd chosen not to leave either. And that choice, that commitment to stay, to work, to love through all the seasons of life, had made all the difference.